Berlin, April 1945. At this moment, the city still appears to exist in a recognizable form. Buildings still stand in rows that suggest order. Streets still connect places in ways that suggest meaning. But none of that reflects reality anymore. Because what remains of Berlin is not a functioning city. It is a structure continuing its own disappearance. People still move through it, but their movement no longer reflects intention in the traditional sense. They are not progressing through a city. They are passing through the final phase of its existence. Every street they walk is already part of something that has effectively ended. It just has not finished collapsing yet. Above ground, explosions interrupt the continuity of perception. Below ground, silence becomes the only stable condition. And between these two environments, reality begins to fracture into layers that no longer align with each other. Time no longer behaves consistently. In some places, minutes feel extended beyond recognition. In others, entire hours disappear without emotional trace. There is no longer a shared experience of time, only localized perception. And this is where the first real transformation begins. Not destruction, but disconnection. Because a city does not die when its buildings fall. It dies
The collapse
when its
of Berlin
continuity
does
can
not
no longer
begin
be
with a single
experienced as whole.
catastrophic moment. It begins with fragmentation. Systems stop aligning with each other. Information becomes unreliable. Movement becomes reactive instead of structured. And slowly, people begin to adjust not to events, but to instability itself. Inside shelters, communication reduces to necessity, not because there is nothing left to say, but because meaning no longer guarantees accuracy. Every statement now carries uncertainty. Above ground, soldiers navigate a landscape that no longer offers orientation. What was once a map becomes repetition. Smoke, fire, ruin. The same visual language repeated endlessly with no variation. At some point, even fear changes its function. It no longer predicts danger. It confirms presence. And presence is constant, which means fear becomes continuous. And continuous fear eventually loses definition, because the human mind cannot differentiate intensity when intensity never stops. This is where survival begins to shift from active decision-making to passive continuation. People are no longer choosing actions. They are simply remaining in motion long enough to avoid immediate termination of movement. And this is the first stage where life stops behaving like life.
As the intensity of destruction increases, Berlin stops behaving like a space that can be navigated. It becomes something else entirely. Not a city, not even a battlefield in the traditional sense. It becomes a system of constant interruption, where nothing remains stable long enough to be understood as place. Every explosion does not just destroy matter, it interrupts continuity. What existed a moment ago cannot be carried forward into what comes next. And this is where reality begins to fail in a deeper way. Not visually, but structurally. Tanks move through the streets not as symbols of control or dominance, but as forces passing through weakened matter that no longer resists in any meaningful form. They do not need to force their way forward. They simply continue moving because there is nothing left capable of stopping them. Inside buildings, time collapses into isolated fragments of action. A door opens, a wall shakes, a ceiling fractures, dust fills the air, then silence returns. But these events are no longer connected. They do not form a sequence that can be understood as progression.
They exist independently, as if the city can no longer maintain continuity between moments. Even survival begins to change its meaning. It is no longer an active process guided by choice or strategy. It becomes a reduced form of continuation. Breathing continues, movement continues, reaction continues. But none of these actions are anchored in expectation of outcome. They are only anchored in immediate necessity. And that necessity is becoming increasingly minimal, because as structure disappears, so does the complexity of decision-making. Everything reduces to one principle: remain in motion long enough not to be immediately eliminated. And this is not life in the traditional sense. It is a transitional condition between existence and cessation. At some point, even perception begins to lose its ability to differentiate scale. Small events and large events begin to feel identical in emotional weight. A collapsing wall and a distant explosion carry the same internal impact, not because they are equal in magnitude, but because the system that interprets magnitude is breaking down. There is no longer enough stability in the environment to maintain contrast, and without contrast, understanding becomes impossible. This is also the stage where memory begins to fail in real time. Not memory of the past, but the memory of the immediate present. What just happened is no longer reliably connected to what is happening now. Each moment stands alone, without continuity, and without continuity, experience becomes unanchored. The city is no longer being fought over, it is being reduced, not through a single decisive act, but through continuous removal of everything that once made it coherent. Buildings lose function before they lose form. Streets lose meaning before they lose structure. And people lose orientation before they lose physical presence. At this stage, even fear begins to flatten, not because danger disappears, but because the mind can no longer calibrate levels of threat. Everything is simply ongoing, and ongoing becomes the only available category of perception. And somewhere inside this ongoing collapse, the idea of before and after begins to disappear completely, because there is no longer enough stability to define transition, only states, continuous states of degradation. And this is where Berlin begins to approach its final condition, not as destruction in progress,
By
but
this
as
stage, Berlin
destruction
no longer
that has
contains
lost the
anything that can
need
be
for
described through
progress.
normal human reference. Scale itself begins to fail. What once felt large now feels temporary. What once felt permanent now feels unstable even in memory. There is no longer a sense of hierarchy between events. A collapsing building and a single falling object carry the same perceptual weight. Because the system that interprets importance is no longer functioning, inside the city, human roles begin to dissolve not through ideology, but through exhaustion of structure. Soldiers, civilians, medics, and children no longer operate within separate categories of meaning. They are reduced to movement through unstable space, not identities, not narratives, just presence inside continuous disruption. Shelters, which once represented protection, begin to lose their conceptual function. They still exist physically, but their meaning has degraded. Protection requires a belief in predictable outcome, and predictability no longer exists. Above ground, entire streets disappear not as singular catastrophic events, but as accumulated structural failure reaching completion. Buildings do not fall in the dramatic sense anymore. They simply cease to remain upright over time. Objects remain behind without narrative context. A chair without a room, a photograph without continuity of identity, a clock without temporal function. Each object becomes a fragment of a system that can no longer be reconstructed mentally. At this stage, even emotional response begins to flatten, not because emotion disappears, but because there is no longer enough stability for emotional differentiation. Fear, grief, shock, exhaustion, They begin to merge into a single continuous condition, awareness of irreversible collapse, and this awareness becomes constant, not rising or falling, just present. As the destruction reaches saturation, something unexpected occurs. The city stops evolving in any direction, not forward, not backward, not even downward. It simply continues without change in structure. And this lack of change is itself a form of ending. Fire no longer spreads as event, it spreads as completion. As if everything that can burn has already agreed to participate in its own transformation into absence. Soldiers and civilians begin to share the same environment of silence, not because conflict has been resolved, but because distinction no longer produces operational difference. They move through identical conditions: smoke, rubble, wind, and intermittent sound that no longer belongs to a stable source. At this point, survival is no longer a strategy, it is residual motion, a continuation that has not yet been terminated simply because no final boundary has been reached. And then something subtle begins to replace everything else. Reduction, not destruction, not escalation, reduction of complexity. What remains is no longer narrative, not even sequence, only elemental perception, fire, smoke, movement, silence. And within this reduction, the idea of city becomes impossible to sustain, because a city requires structure, connection, continuity, all of which have already dissolved. Berlin, April 1945, does not end in a moment of clarity. It ends in the absence of further differentiation. There is no final event that can be isolated as conclusion, only the realization that continuation is no longer necessary for anything to remain visible. The last movements through the ruins are no longer meaningful in terms of opposition or direction. They are simply motion within ending, and at some point, even ending loses definition, because ending implies contrast with continuation, and contrast no longer exists. What remains is not victory, not defeat, not even survival. What remains is residue, the afterstate of something that once had structure, a place that existed, a place that no longer exists, and a perception of time that can no longer separate beginning from disappearance. And the question that remains, not as historical question but as existential one, how long does it take for a city to disappear when people are still inside it? And what does it mean for time to continue after meaning has already ended?